Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. So, last one in our series of three lectures for this week on the aspects of the revolution. So, we've looked at the Enlightenment and its ideas and its conflicts and its new constructions. And then we looked at the American Revolution, which borrowed many of those principles and ideas, coming up with their own sense of identity that would eventually culminate in a revolution of resistance to change, to remove themselves of the shackles of Great Britain, right? And now we have another example, the French Revolution. Okay, so we're going to look at another iteration of how a group of people decided to take ideas of the Enlightenment and apply them to their own current circumstance and manifest a new sense of self. Now, I am not getting into all the details of the French Revolution because it is actually quite ironic that it goes from monarchy to revolution to republic back to monarchy. um, but what we are going to do is we're going to look at how the Enlightenment influences these ideas in terms of individuality, freedom, self-governance, the rights of people, right? All of these aspects. Okay, so let's take a look. And also to be clear, the French Revolution is one of those moments in world history that really resonates well into the 19th and 20th centuries, especially when countries, decide to assert their own independence or resistance or revolution. Um, they often call upon the principles of the French Revolution as justification for their actions. Okay, so let's take a look. Now, please feel free to take a look at some of the documentaries and the other documents that I have attached to the module. But also, it's important for us to really understand like what was happening on the eve of the revolution because France at this time is a world of dichotomies, right? We have both a lot of good that is happening in this country, and then we also have a lot of bad. And I would think it's safe to say that those were both in a world of extremes. So if you were in the part that was good, it was extremely good. If you were experiencing the part that was bad, it was extremely bad. But on the eve of the revolution in 1789, a couple things to note in terms of the good. France is the second most populous country outside of Russia. It is extremely influential in terms of its culture, in terms of its language. It is the second most spoken language in Europe. It is the language that is deemed by the educated and the elites of Europe to be the language that you want to have your children instructed in, that you should be able to speak yourself. The economy for a certain portion of the country was doing quite well. There is money that is coming in from abroad, from the colonial holdings, namely from Santo Domingue, which is later be known as Haiti. But it is the world's leading producer of both sugar and coffee. And so this makes for some very lucrative and financial benefits for the country of France. And so, in 1789, the elites and those people of influence in France are enjoying extreme wealth, extreme power, extreme influence, right? Things are going very well. The bad part is that France was um, financially unstable. There were several problems in terms of reform. Basically, the inability to make changes because French people were very much entrenched in their traditions, very entrenched in their systems, which they had come to rely upon and had been passed down after generation, whether those are the guilds that protect various craftsmen like the leather or leather guilds or the silk guilds or the diamond guild. or if that was going to be protected in terms of the nobility, if to try to change and reform certain aspects was very difficult. And so, because of these inabilities to change, this really left France in a very vulnerable position. Also, the economy is rather uneven. If you're, as I mentioned, if you're wealthy and you're doing well, the economy is working for you. If you are one of the landless peasants, and or if you are living literally hand to mouth on the land, you're not doing too well because there were several periods prior to 1789 where grain prices, skyrocket. There's various periods of what you would call like minor famine. The ground is not the lands and the agriculture are not producing as much, and so of course that increases the cost as well as the access to various resources. And the Industrial Revolution, which is the first Industrial Revolution, which is taking place throughout Europe, isn't really taking hold at the speed as other countries like it is in France. France is lagging behind. And this is going to lead the country into a period of, underdevelopment, which is going to leave many people in serious poverty and general instability. But it should also be clear that there's also regional differences. Many of the cultures and the traditions are very regionally influenced, and so the south of France looks very different from the north, as does the west and the east. And so to understand France at this time, it is a complicated amalgam of various cultures and traditions, which are steeped in their history. But with the need to modernize and to provide for a growing and developing country, the government at the time, the monarchy under Louis the XVI, is not able to meet these demands. And this will ultimately be manifested in the revolution, which is caused by several different factors. So given the period of the Enlightenment that is taking place throughout Europe and in particular in France, we have several events that, because the Enlightenment really influence people to question the authority of the monarchy, the privilege of the nobles, the control of the guilds, right? If individuals are being presented ideas, that are questioning the role of government or the role and the divine of, of leaders such as kings or monarchs, and they are thinking about their own positions and how they have or they should have more control. This is really what sets the stage for this revolution, and there's a couple of factors. The first is the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which happens in the United States. Now, remember, the French did aid the United States, aided us in our war against Great Britain. And the French that fought alongside us, for this idea of liberty and freedom, it was more of a power play for the French to demonstrate um, their willingness to support anybody who was against their enemy. And, more or less another feather in their cap, so to speak, as to say, like, look, we've got enough money and enough influence to be able to help somebody else with their revolution so that they can beat England. And it certainly was something that did give France more clout and more legitimacy, but it also nearly bankrupts them. So there's something to be gained, but something to also to be severely impacted by this. But nonetheless, the Declaration of Independence certainly influences the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But that was very much supported, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the ambassador to France at the time, during these periods or in the early parts of the Revolution, he had a very strong hand in guiding its prose. And so this is, you should see that the Declaration of the Rights of Man really borrow from, the Declaration of Independence. And, Jefferson had a hand in that. The second uh, area that is influencing the changes that are going on in Europe and that would lead to the revolution are the fact that literacy rates are increasing throughout the country, that people are reading, they're reading more, and they're also having the opportunity in which to discuss and meet about the things that they're reading. So the things that France is very famous for currently, are these cafes. Well, that really begins in this period of the 1770s and 1780s, mainly to do with the lifestyle of being able to, enjoy the benefits of, the production of coffee from Haiti. It was coming to France, and so they're able to produce this product, and cafes open up. People sit there, they enjoy a cup of coffee, and they also discuss and have ideas. They're discussing Voltaire, they're discussing Rousseau, they're discussing John Locke. They are discussing these ideas, and this is what develops what Habermas, another philosopher, comes up with this idea of the public sphere, right? This notion that there is a public opinion or a space in which people can come to some sort of understanding or awareness, not just of the ideas that are out there, but how the individual is a part of a larger group, right? Or a part of several groups within this sphere. And then, of course, we have the Enlightenment thinkers themselves. You have the Spirit of the Laws from Montesquieu. You have various discussions of the separation of powers. And because the way that the structures of government in France at the time it is a monarchical society, right? It is a king with total power and authority. Nobles, share somewhat in those rights, but they too want a little bit more power and authority. The growing middle class, known as the bourgeoisie, is also covetous of certain new rights. And of course, you have the landed peasantry, who is also looking for more control or opportunity in their experience. And so, combination of reading, combination of, the ability to share one's perspectives, the engagement with each other, and then plus the materials which they're engaging in, whether it is the Enlightenment thinkers or just, satirical pieces of information, such as those that were produced at the time, often, scandalous stories that, of course, were completely fictitious, but nonetheless often put the authority of the time, whether it is the king or Marie Antoinette or the clergy, um, as a point of satire and critique, right? That they're using their power for devious purposes or the sexualization of the leadership of the country as a way to, call into question its legitimacy. And so, what ends up happening with the French Revolution, and you can take a look here, but really what we're looking at is how the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen really embody the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, but as well as the Enlightenment thinkers. This idea that individuals, and if I can, pull it up here for you, if you click on the 1789 document, take a look at it. What it aims is that it shows that within this public sphere that begins to develop in France, that there is the right of individuals in which to participate in their own in their own, choosing of how they want to be represented, of their own direction in life. Like it discusses this idea of how people should be protected by the army, how leaders should represent the people, that people should have certain rights and protections, such as being presumed innocent, right? That all of these notions that the laws themselves need to be for the public good, and that, that the natural rights of people are not something to be decided upon by, a king, but are instead, a part of who people are in their innate state. That these are aspects to which they can determine for themselves, and that it is not the right of any one authority in which to determine it for themselves. But what you'll see in this document is very much parallel to what our Declaration of Independence says, what our Constitution would later say. And so, these are areas. And so what you want to think about is how do these ideas really begin to assert this sense of individualization, right? These rights that are derived from the natural being of man, right? This notion that people can determine for themselves what path they want to take, and that it is the right of no individual in which to deny them that opportunity. So think about where we came from, Luther in terms of questioning the authority of the church in terms of determining one's fate, to now being allowed to determine it for yourself, literally a period of 250 years, and how that has evolved into this state. Because very much of what you're reading in 1789 or what we're reading in 1776 is, what we experience today. We take that as, for lack of a better term, Bible, right? It is a fact. This is just how we are, and it is sacred to us because this is the life and the understanding that we have. But as we'll see, these concepts are continually evolving, right? Because as we see that very much in the documents of our founding, whether it's the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, right, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, these are things that are going to be amended, right? Because once we begin to think about rights for one group or rights for one set of people, then the question becomes, well, why not this? Right? If I can think about rights in this way, can I think of rights in another way? Right? How do we expand them? How do they get contracted? And so, take a look at these ideas, because what's really key is that these legacies of the French Revolution, of the American Revolution, are going to inspire others around the world, whether those are the independence fights that'll take place in South America against Spain and Portugal, whether those are going to be the liberalization, fights that are going to take place throughout the continent of Africa and the continent of Asia, right, against European imperialism, right? All of these areas, the French Revolution has inspired cultural changes, ideological changes, social changes, right? Is that we begin to see in this period the sense that people start to think of themselves as a group, a group in terms of, a group of people that see themselves in multiplicities, right? Multiple identities, right? A peasant, a noble, French people, Europeans, white people, right? All of these ideas in terms of these multiplicities. And we see ourselves very much in the same way. Our identities that we have today are multiple in nature, right? You could have, it's what is going to be, later termed, what we would call this convergence, right, of these identities, of how individuals can have multiple experiences across an entire spectrum of a life, right? That you can be both a husband, a father, a person of color, a religious individual, right? All of these ideas that culminate in the totalizing of an individual experience. And that's really what is born out of this legacy of the French Revolution, is that people began to realize that there were multiplicities of multiple experiences of themselves within that movement, right? We also see the political reforms, right? Of course, right? Whether it's the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, whether it's the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, right? We're talking about the abolishment of the monarchical system, feudalism, systems of privilege that are inherited, right? All of these things, culminate because of the Industrial Revolution, the Revolution, all of these aspects. But more importantly, we also see how the changes in terms of this idea of being our identities tied to a monarchy or a king or a lineage begin to shift in terms of a national identity, right? That there's a shared culture, right? The experience of what does it mean to be an American or a Frenchman or a European or an African, right? What does this mean, these cultural identities, right? Because we see this. We're going to see this in the decolonization that's going to happen throughout Africa and Asia when we look at this idea that there is that Pan-Africanist notion, right? And so we're going to see these notions, and that's really what comes out of the French Revolution. And also what we're going to see is that in many times when you have these periods of civil unrest, of social and cultural changes, there's often an opening for people to take power and to guide it in various ways that can be very destructive, namely in the form of despots and dictators. And whether that is in the form of, an individual like Napoleon or somebody like Hitler or even somebody like a president, right? You see that in periods of unease, of economic uncertainty, of periods of instability, this often leads to leaders who claim to have the answer, and it leads people into following individuals that they don't often understand. But we'll look more into that as we go further in the next weeks ahead. Okay? So if you have any questions, just reach out.